We generally regard anxiety as a sense of impending difficulty or reverse, a fear of danger, but usually not of obvious physical danger. Danger involving unknown elements, danger rooted in doubts, uncertainties, or fears concerning intangibles. Anxiety as a very common and natural and ancient emotion is not easily overcome. Yet, like all negative attitudes, it is of itself detrimental and must therefore be considered as a symptom of an urgent need for some type of internal reorganization. Anxiety in our common daily living centers mostly on environmental circumstances. We have natural fears about our obligations, a concern for our dependents, worries over the young, and, in large, worry about the whole world. These worries and fears have come to be regarded as indicative of the serious person. An individual without anxieties today would be regarded with suspicion. It would be assumed that he was not taking life with proper seriousness. There's a great deal of difference, however, between a thoughtful, serious approach to life and the building up of these banks of fears or agitations, which generally reflect adversely on our conduct and therefore contribute to the complications of living. It is noted, for one thing, that in order to develop a really thorough case of anxiety, it is not only important to have troubles, it is equally important to have a certain measure of aloneness in which to nurse the troubles. It is more difficult to be in a state of anxiety when surrounded by interesting, happy people or important events. Thus, the anxious person usually builds his anxieties during periods in which he is alone. One of the most common, of course, is one of those tossing, restless nights in which nearly always we can work up a negative attitude on something. Another type, of course, is the chronic anxiety of the person who lives alone. And the equally difficult type of anxiety that comes to a person who may live with others, but who has cultivated a strong sense of isolation. There are persons who live in consistent and constant mingling with other people, yet have built walls of attitudes around themselves so completely that they are truly alone in a crowd. There are also others who have allowed their anxieties to gradually destroy their social existence. They have caused other persons to find them uninteresting and disappointing as people. It is true that a good friend will very often stand with us firmly through a crisis or through a period of unusual tension or stress. But it is hard to find people who enjoy being with us if we are chronic worriers. If our anxieties are continuous, if we can only solve one problem to fall into another, our friends gradually give up any effort to influence our lives constructively. Thus, there are two kinds of anxieties. those which arise from real causes, and those which arise from chronic temperamental tendencies. People are not always anxious because of conditions. Many persons face very difficult situations with comparatively little of the anxiety mechanism. Others in the most trivial circumstances, where nothing of importance is really pending, can become continuously anxious. Like the individual who once said that he was particularly worried at that time because for some reason there did not seem to be anything to worry about. This was a very bad symptom and could lead to some great disaster. Or the person who is so chronically anxious that they regard any peaceful interlude as merely a moment of quiet before a storm. They do not know when the storm is coming or what it will be, but they assume that it will come. Now, of course, most of these people are basically right, but they are right in the wrong way. In the course of life, if we wait long enough, some difficulty will inevitably arise. This can be assumed as factual. We cannot expect to go through life in the continuous presence of the involvements of our present way of life without occasionally having difficult moments. These difficult moments, however, are usually in the minimum. We will have many days, many hours, many weeks, and even years of comparative security before one of these difficult moments, a truly difficult one, suddenly looms over the horizon. Thus, the anxious person is one who has thrown his emphasis on the wrong circumstance pattern in his own life. He has become unable to estimate the relationship between good and bad. He regards anxieties as the high points in his life, and all other instances are merely shadows of very little importance or reality. We have a tendency to regard happiness as unreal and unhappiness as stark reality. We throw all our weight, therefore, into our difficulties and become oblivious to the many privileges, opportunities, and advantages that we enjoy. The anxious person has the tendency and almost the genius to be able to pass through a long series of pleasant interludes without being pleased, without having any sense of fulfillment. He is merely breathlessly waiting for trouble. And if he holds his breath long enough, he will have some kind of trouble. If he holds it long enough, probably he'll drop dead. But anyway, he will have trouble. There is trouble in every life. But we weigh and balance these difficult situations. Now, philosophy enters into the picture. And philosophy points out the possibility of capitalizing on difficulties. In other words, the causes of anxiety are also the sources of instruction. If, however, we have a good melancholy mood, education of this kind does not interest us. We regard all pressure as adversity. Yet if we watch and think, we will realize how much adversity has done for us in comparison to the few things it has done to us. Adversity is challenge. It is opportunity. It is responsibility. It is the privilege of the individual to rise above circumstances and establish his own nature. Most people, however, regard all arduous endeavor, all effort to go against the courses or streams of apparent event. They regard such resistance as painful, difficult, and a misfortune. As a result of this attitude, we find that most people make mistakes joyously and grow painfully. The best things in life that they enjoy most do the least for them, whereas the things which they most fear are their greater benefactors. Philosophy teaches us to weigh these elements, not in the sense of a sour grape acceptance, but in a serious effort to try to learn why problems arise. Anxieties arise either within the temperament or within the environment. If they rise within the temperament, they indicate that there is something basically wrong with ourselves. If they arise in the environment, they may also indicate that there is something wrong with the way in which we manage our affairs, or something wrong with the relationships we hold to other persons. We are making mistakes, usually, if critical situations arise. Now, there are certain cases, of course, where anxiety arises from the most apparently just causes. And it is not probable or likely that the individual will completely free himself from certain worries and doubts and misgivings, but he certainly can reduce them to a minimum. He can certainly recover from the habit of hurting himself needlessly. And a great part of our anxiety mechanism is purely psychological. This may be contrasted, of course, to the worries, the desperate problems that arise when a mother watches a sick child. In a case of this nature, anxiety is almost inevitable. It is a very essential part of our humanity, and we cannot do very much about it. We can only seek faith, consolation, hope in the deepest values that we possess. But such anxieties are more or less in the minimum. Our more constant anxieties are simply our fears of things likely to happen to us, things which we do not want to have happen. And we may gain as great a sense of anxiety out of some trivial thing that we just do not like, as we will suffer from the most devastating natural catastrophe. Nature also provides us with a very interesting type of psychic equipment. Nature is prepared to help the anxious person. If this anxiety is real, if the situations are actually true, and if, as occasionally must happen, we must face some very grave decision or some very difficult situation, nature provides us with certain types of glandular secretions which help us to meet these emergencies. Nature automatically releases the sense of strength in us. This is the reason why so often we are able to stand successfully almost any real emergency. We find a new strength available to us out of a very wonderful natural process. If, however, we fall into chronic anxiety, then we draw off this reserve. Nature cannot provide it constantly in a tremendous abundance. Nature saves it for things that are necessary. If we waste it in the constant development of false situations, then we are impoverished when a real emergency arises. Thus it is very important for us to preserve in ourselves the chemistries of psychic strength which nature provides. We must use them sparingly and when they are needed. We must allow nature to automatically provide them, giving us this wonderful sense of self-control in a very desperate situation, or a tremendous sense of vital ability in a real emergency. Persons who drive automobiles a great deal know something of this emergency reserve power. Nearly everyone who has driven a car has had some close shaves, very near to time when a serious accident might occur. When it seems that the situation is almost impossible to avoid, the individual usually senses a slowing down within himself of motion, which really means probably the tremendous increase in the rapidity of his reflexes. He seems to have more time, but what really is happening is that he is operating more rapidly. And intuitively and instinctively, he will usually have the solution, if one is at all possible. He will see how he can evade this situation. He will see how he can prevent it from happening. And he seems to have a tremendous time allotment in which to do it, although it may be only a fraction of a second. And in this fraction of a second, nature has released such a tremendous superior power and energy that his mind, his emotions, and his reflexes are appropriately speeded up, and he avoids the accident. This type of situation occurs in our emotional and mental lives also, where there is a genuine need for some unexpected ability. Man finds more within himself than he ever suspected. He does have, apparently, almost a divine aid. He has almost an intercession of power or life when he really needs it. But if he wastes it, if he develops merely a chronic attitude, this is false. Nature may provide this intercessional power a dozen times, but ultimately nature will cease where the emergencies are false. Nature will not provide for these pressures that only arise from the dispositional debilities of the individual. Then later, when a really great emergency does come, nature's processes are slower. We do not have this sudden advantage. We do not have the availability of this almost divine presence because we have abused it, misused it, and wasted the reflexes which produce it. Thus it is very important for us to keep all anxiety, fear mechanisms, worries, and disaster feelings as much under control as possible. If we control them every day, we will find that in real need, we will have exceptional clarity of insight. But if we do not deserve this clarity, in some way we waste it or draw it off and are no longer able to receive it when we need it. One other problem, of course, is that anxiety, like nearly all negative mental and emotional attitudes, requires considerable time allotment. People, in order to be truly anxious, must make sort of a career of it. They must gradually neglect other attitudes. They must even neglect labor or work, or develop such anxiety mechanisms that they are not employable. They must use a great deal of their living time in this pursuit, and gradually they will find that it will encroach upon their sleeping time. They will find that their anxiety disturbs their rest. It further causes various symbolic and psychopathic dreams. It causes the individual to lose his power of relaxation. It causes him to be unable to develop these psychic rest periods, which are very important to us. One of the major problems of industry today is the coffee break. Today, the coffee break has become such an institution that it is estimated that it adds from 5 to 7% to the cost of everything that is produced in this country. Just the time in which the individual wants to get that pickup. Well, the coffee break has some advantages, and within moderation it is certainly also helpful. Whether the coffee is or not is a question, but the break is. But if this break is useful as a natural break of tempo, it is also necessary for the worrier and the anxious person to have his periodic coffee breaks. Unless he finds ways of breaking through his anxieties, he will have very little ability to remedy the condition. Very few emotions or mental attitudes can be cured by simply sitting with them and stewing in them. The individual will find that if he tries a head-on collision with his tendency to be anxious, that he will just simply develop new forms of exhaustion and new anxieties. An important recognition comes from our study of child psychology. Most of our emotions and many of our thoughts are rather childish. They have to be treated as children are treated. One of the things you must never do is let a child believe that you take it too seriously. If you become an obvious servant of your child will become an obvious master of your life. And it is not good for you, and it is not good for the child. Children should not appear to be too important. They should not develop an early sense that their attitudes are likely to affect the climate of the entire family. The child should certainly be important, but it should not gain the sense of its own importance. The same is true of emotional attitudes. Worry is a more or less adolescent or childish emotion. We regard it as a symbol of mature thoughtfulness. We figure that if our faces are all twisted up in a most distorted look of anxiety, that then we are thorough, deep thinking citizens. We are not. We are really rather foolish children. And with the case of anxiety, you get much further by ignoring it than you do by fighting it. Your problem is always to find ways of making it less important, less meaningful, giving it less control over your life. It is not the object of the anxiety that must always receive attention. It is the fact that you are anxious. If you will look back through life, you will observe that you have survived a number of critical situations about which once you were very anxious. You find that many of the most difficult situations that you expect never happen. Others smooth themselves out almost miraculously, and still others perhaps are never completely solved, but they pass into limbo among the half-forgotten things of life. These problems are not always factually as great as they seem to be. In fact, they are seldom in proportion to the anxiety that is bestowed upon them by a chronic worrier. If then we begin to feel that our anxieties are causing us to have too narrow or limited a viewpoint, it is perhaps important to do something about it. One of the more common patterns of this kind is anxiety over children. Now, there are periods in life when this anxiety is reasonably necessary. But most of the anxiety is the result of failure to apply basic principles when they were needed. Our anxieties arise after we have made a series of mistakes ourselves. We have failed to give the necessary companionship. We have failed to understand. We have failed to discipline properly. And gradually the situation reaches a difficult one, in which suddenly it appears that we might have a delinquent on our hands. This would naturally be a cause of grave anxiety. But we must recognize that the anxiety arose probably from a failure to meet problems factually at some previous time. And if we are chronic worriers, we were probably worrying at times when we should have been doing something. And as a result of blind anxiety, we permitted conditions to go uncorrected. But after we reach a certain point in bringing up the young, we observe the increasing need for their own individuality. And we come finally to a condition in which these younger persons must live their own lives. If our anxieties then continue on into the maturity of these young people, we are likely to injure them and hurt ourselves. The reason why most people cling to small thoughts or to familiar thoughts is because they do not have any large ones. They have made small things dominant values. They have allowed comparatively unimportant trivia to become the only excuse for life. Some people honestly believe that if they cannot worry over how their children should bring up their children, there is nothing left in life. I know families in which anxiety reaches a certain peak, and then everybody dashes to the telephone and phones all the relatives to see if they're all right. It has developed around this idea. If you don't get a letter every week, telegraph. The person is probably dying. Actually, the person is waiting for the letter you haven't written them for 6 months. But the anxiety patterns do not operate both ways. I know many people who are constantly complaining about their friends for being poor correspondents, and they are the poorest of all themselves. Or else they write letters which no one can read, and which contain a mass of bad news that no one wanted. So anxieties arise from these various causes, but one is the lack of important internal living. The individual who recognizes life to be a calculated risk, and it is from beginning to end, does all that he can to meet these emergencies with the skill of a person playing a good game of chess. Each problem becomes a challenge, and the person who has important things to do is constantly figuring how he can win in this particular challenge. The person with very little to do is the one who is in constant fear of losing. The reason why he is in fear of losing usually is because he does not have enough incentive to drive him to win. Instead of having a clear-cut plan to which he can unite his resources so that he knows step by step what he is doing, he perhaps has a hazy hope of happiness or peace of mind, and having no machinery erected to advance this purpose, having no clear insight as to what he should do next, he is constantly in bewilderment. And bewilderments can easily lead into anxieties. The bewildered person is already 2/3 a worrier by this circumstance alone. So as we go along through life, we will either have worries and anxieties, or else we will have purposes. And these purposes can be very important. I was talking to a very good friend of mine who was a doctor not long ago about a patient. This patient was suffering from an incurable ailment, and the medical profession had decided that probably they had 3 to 6 months to live. But talking the case over, this doctor expressed something which I think might be worth passing on, although perhaps many of you realize it already. This doctor said, everything from here on depends upon what this person does with the time allotment that we reasonably presume him to have. According to history of his type of ailment, he has 3 months to 6 months to live. If this crushes him, and he insisted on knowing the truth, if this crushes him, he will live for 3 months, maybe less. If he decides to do all he can while he's alive, he will probably make the 6 months. But now comes something else. It is quite conceivable that under the drive of a tremendous purpose, this individual could live a year, 2 years, or 3 years. We cannot say how long he will live. We gave him 3 months to 6 months. If the shock of what we told him had been great enough, He might have died in the office while we were telling him. He said, we examine people every day and find them in perfect condition and they're dead within a week. We find someone else, we say, my, you're in pretty bad shape. You better take care of yourself. And this individual may bury us. We don't know. But one thing we do know, namely, that the continuity of purpose in the presence of sickness has a great deal to do with the extension of life. Now, it may not be able to overcome the ailment. The ailment may be too deep-seated. The destruction may be too great. The only thing that we can conceive is the extension of life as the result of attitude. Now, the individual involved in this particular case took a very amazing attitude. Instead of settling back and waiting for the end, this individual decided to travel. They're starting out now on a trip which would normally last a year. They're going out and they're going to go and see the things they've always wanted to see. They're going to interesting places. They're going to forget about the disease. If it catches up with them along the way, that's it. Chances are, as I talk to the doctor again, the chances are they will not only come back, but may extend the trip considerably. It depends on this willingness or this power to rise above our own tendency to the melancholy reflection upon life, which a situation of this kind may cause. There is a well-known case of an important civic leader in this country who also had one of these death sentences thrown upon him by his health. Yet he had a comparatively long term of public office unexpired. The expectancy of his ailment was that he could never live to complete that term of office. He did, because he felt that at the moment he could not be replaced. He had projects for the community good which required the doing. There was no one else to do them, and he did live and complete term of office and passed on a short time afterward. But he lived to do the thing that he felt had to be done. Now, this positive attitude is very real, and we cannot escape the implication of it. How much more real is it if the person who has very few physical factors against them, whose probabilities of life are normal, who has the right to look forward to 20 or 30 years of more constructive living? With a person of this kind, anxiety and fear and worry will shorten the reasonable expectancies of life. Now, many people are chronic worriers and seem to live a long time. This can happen because human beings are individuals. But statistics lined up and classified and studied will indicate that a life is heavily influenced by its attitudes. And even if physical existence may appear to be prolonged, the individual is not enjoying that existence. It is not meaningful to him. His extension of years is merely a continuation of his misfortunes in his own mind. So the mere blessing of years is not too helpful if many of those years are going to be burdened with such a profound neurosis that nothing valuable can be accomplished. So the anxious person is invited strongly to integrate a purposeful pattern for living, a pattern in which values become more insistent than fears, in which the individual is more concerned with the doing of things than he is in the worry about the hazards associated with these accomplishments. That is perhaps one of the reasons why some very interesting and important late careers have developed in society. And it is quite probable that if a group of geniuses whom we now regard with considerable respect If this group, consisting of persons in many fields of endeavors, if these persons had all died at 60, the world would probably have lost from 20 to 30% of their genius. Many of these persons achieved late. They achieved at times when most persons would be merely drowning in their own anxieties, worries, fears, and the sense of impending age. Yet these persons were not so moved, but they were carried by a more tremendous drive of value. The average citizen does not have a sufficient opportunity, or does not make the opportunity, to develop these drives. And these are not drives of ambition, or very often they are not. It may, of course, be that the level of consciousness of the individual makes some rather physical or practical situation the principal drive in his life. But these drives can be of many kinds. And with older persons, these drives are more likely to be on the level of idea than they are on the level of action. But the drive must be there. It is the only cure for the constant encroachment of negation. An individual is either growing or rotting. No one is standing still. The status quo is impossible. Everything is either unfolding itself or it is withering away. Negative attitudes do cause this withering. They cause a blight upon all purposes. Positive attitudes do a great deal to improve the probabilities of a happy and successful life. As philosophy helps us in understanding the challenge of living, helps us to recognize law and order, reason and common sense in the things that happen to us. So religion also makes a very important contribution to the anxious person. Most persons whose anxieties have come to be too dominant are truly persons of little faith. The mystic, the idealist, the dreamer, who falls into anxiety simply indicates that he has never experienced what he professes to believe. And here we see, of course, the continual, ageless testing of conviction. We live in a world in which there are many very noble and beautiful convictions, and yet a large percentage of people live badly. This is because these convictions have never actually been applied to self. They have moved upon the surface of the outer mind, but they have never been experienced within consciousness. We do not hold these truths to be applicable to ourselves, and we do not apply them. So in the terms of the anxious person, faith can become a very real and vital factor. There comes a time in the lives of most people when a certain part of their experience must be handed back to the divine power. While things are going relatively well with us, we are masters of all situation, and we give out advice very freely. But when difficulties begin to accumulate and situations are well out of hand, then there is almost inevitably the instinct to seek divine help, to seek the help and strength of some power greater than our own. We are self-sufficient in our pleasures, but we are not self-sufficient in our sorrows. Thus we turn to some kind of consoling power, some principle, some spiritual energy to assist us in these climatic situations. The psychologist, of course, tells us that this is a psychochemical process by which what we are really doing is calling upon our own unexplored and unexperienced inner resources. That the thing we are really suddenly doing is trying to be ourselves. That we have suddenly recognized the need of the total person to meet the total need. And in this total person, we use the archetype of deity as a symbol of the complete potential of life, whether in ourselves or in the universe. In any event, however we wish to explain it, the individual finds the need for this kind of spiritual consolation. This is one of the reasons why the person with very little understanding of life, very little inner resource, and deficient in the philosophical and spiritual equations of life, has fewer defenses and less support to his consciousness than the idealist. In time of emergency, materialism offers very little to help the person in trouble. Materialism can help him to accumulate things around him, but his needs, when they arise within him, are not met by the materialistic or even the humanistic attitude. The individual needs the sense of the reality of a divine plan. Now, if we do accept, as most people do, at least we will say in part, nominally accept, that there is a divine principle at the source of life, that this principle is true and real, then it is difficult for us to justify a great many of our own attitudes. If we believe that the universe is good, why do we spend our entire lifetime fearing it? If we believe that God is running the universe, why are we continually fearful lest we be the victims of injustice? If we actually have the conviction in ourselves that this universe is a spiritual being, that within it essential good is always dominant, why are we constantly giving strength to evil and being unaware of this goodness? Why do we consistently live in a state of terror if the world we live in is part of the very nature and substance of God? Ancient man struggled through this dilemma, trying to understand how he could believe in a God of good and then live a life of fear. And he finally solved the problem, not by changing himself, but by altering his theology, which was the most simple way of doing it. He suddenly decided that God had an enemy, that this enemy was, for round purposes, referable as the devil. Now, just how the devil got to be that way differs in each theology, but always there is a spirit of negation. There is the rebel angel. There is a power of bad that becomes a continual cause of worry to God. Well, once you get God in a state of worry, it is quite obvious that creation can follow suit with a good spirit. We cannot expect man not to worry if deity lives in continual anxiety concerning the salvation of his own creation. So much under anxiety that he has to keep continuous intercessions of one kind or another. He must continually patch up the works of evil. He must pass from one anxiety to another and appoint a kind of police force composed of archangels to take care of the difficulties arising from a group of gangsters commonly known as demons. This situation throws the universe into conflict. And with the universe going to pieces around him, man cannot be blamed for being a little anxious about the whole thing. So this anxiety was shifted onto a theological level. And this belief of the conflict and struggle going on throughout all the ages between good and evil has really rested heavily upon man since the dawn of time. It has caused him not only to have great fears about himself, but to make positive alignments of one kind, usually the alignment ending in the concept that he belongs with the power of good, and anyone who differs from him belongs with the powers of evil. This is a very convenient attitude, and it also provides us with wonderful opportunities to save other people by requiring that they be like ourselves. By the time this is finished, we have a well-packaged product, but the package is one mass of miseries. Nothing seems to work out well. In religion today, we are inclined more to a mystical approach to this problem. We are inclined more and more to suspect that the divine power at the root of life is good, and that what we call mistakes or evil arise not from this divine power, but from misinterpretation of that power by man himself. That we are ourselves the causes of the various attitudes which we now assume to arise in the divine nature, and that man is full of fear simply because he has never really understood how to be filled with love. His good emotions are not positive enough, not strong enough. And in a very highly commercialized civilization, there seems to be much more incentive to develop selfishness than unselfishness. We are much more inclined to be personal than impersonal. We are more likely to be possessive than to release people. We are much more likely to see evil than good. Because of this tendency to negation in ourselves, we have lost for the large part the simple consolation of spirit, which simply comes from man's fundamental belief that he lives in a universe of good. Now, when people claim to have strong spiritual convictions and still reveal the same anxieties and the same fears and worries that they had before, it simply means that we are in the presence of a division of conviction, and that the division still permits the negative to have dominance over the positive. The conviction toward good is not as strong as the conviction toward evil. How do we strengthen a conviction? We probably strengthen all of our attitudes through experience. We strengthen them through certain experimentation, and we accept those things which are justified in use. And in the search for positive attitudes to counterbalance negative attitudes, we are searching or must search for the proof that the good is true. We must gradually sell ourselves through experience, through experimentation, through observation. We must sell ourselves the reality of our positive attitudes and unsell ourselves on the reality of our negative attitudes. Well, people will say when you pick up the newspaper in the morning, how are you going to sell yourself on a constructive attitude? How are you going to actually say to yourself, things are as they should be, with everything in the world apparently wrong? Well, there's an old philosopher friend I knew years ago, always read the paper in the morning. He was a kindly old gentleman. He always read the paper in the morning because he said it gave him such a new sense of the honesty of God. Well, I know people read it for many reasons, but I doubt if many read it for that purpose. Well, he said, now look, here's a chap that didn't turn in his income tax reports when he should have. He tried to chisel. He kept it up for 4 or 5 years. Now the government's caught up with him. And he's probably going to have a nice fat penalty on his hands. What is more sublime justice than this? It will be sublime to everyone but the man. And he will probably assume the bottom is out of the universe. He will never realize that it's his own fault. Here we have a world that for thousands of years of recorded history has been breaking every rule known to heaven and earth. So at this time the world is in a very bad shape. This is not injustice, this is justice. This is not the absence of God, this is the presence of divine law. And if it looks as though we're in a pretty bad mess, this mess itself proves that an individual or a nation or a world cannot live badly and be happy. Now this is justice. This isn't tragedy. This isn't a proof that nobody cares and that we're poor little forlorn creatures out in the snow. This is merely a proof that we have created the blizzard ourselves and now we're sitting in it. This is not a proof that evil triumphs. It is a proof that evil cannot triumph. And as we go through these great catastrophes, they are nothing but piling up of individual errors. Millions of persons deserving very little that is good achieve an end in which they get very little that is good. This is disappointing, but it is only disappointing to dishonest people. Why don't we face the fact? If we sow the whirlwind, we will reap the whirlwind. Such was the opinion of Cassandra, the ancient muse of doom. Whatever we do must have its consequences. And it is not right for us to assume at this time that we have earned the golden age. There is no earthly reason why this world in its present state should enjoy peace. If we could live as badly as we have for thousands of years and suddenly come into the ripeness of a magnificent spiritual utopia, then there would be no justice in the universe. And private and personal grudges could be handled on the same basis. In other words, if you live the first half of your life badly enough, you should enjoy all of the charms of a delightful old age. Now, who expects it? No one. History doesn't expect it either. So actually, the stories that we read are the stories of mistakes coming home to roost. They are stories of things done and things undone. They are stories of processes that have been followed and proven wrong. But there is nothing in these stories to prove that there is no God or that there is no justice. These things prove conclusively that the purposes of nature are clear, that if we do not abide by these principles, we will never enjoy the securities which they bestow. We cannot break the law and be happy, but we can keep the law and be happy. So these problems become a little bit theological, but not in the popular sense of the word. They also intimate to us that beneath and behind the visible natures of things, there are rules and patterns and values and ways of judging which are entirely apart from our experience. Some of the things that we think are good and are in trouble probably are not as good as we think they are. And some of the bad things that seem to flourish may not really be bad. But we have a different attitude about these things. We have never brought our own attitudes into harmony with universal law. We have simply assumed that when our adversary flourishes, this is bad. When we ourselves flourish, this is good. The motives, reasons, and circumstances do not interest us. Anxiety, then, arises from man's effort in many instances to force situations which are not essentially valid. If we have something that is essentially not so, we may live to see this thing crumble, fall apart. And if we are too addicted to it, we may crumble with it. For many individuals cannot survive the disintegration of their attitudes. An individual with a very strong dogmatic purpose cannot survive this purpose if it fails. Not because the purpose was good, not because the purpose was bad, but because the individual was completely identified with it. So we fall with the things we believe. And when those things are assailed, we are left disconsolate. Actually, anxiety has only certain basic uses. The ancient peoples and even Oriental nations that are supposed to be very tranquil in their desire attitudes do admit that there are certain basic desires which can be cultivated moderately without afflicting the soul too seriously. One of the basic desires that is commendable is man's desire to be useful, his desire to improve in order that he may be useful. Practically no one who is successful is ever happy unless he is useful. So the motivation behind achievement is not mere accomplishment or prestige or honor or distinction or reward. The real motive is usefulness, that the individual may become a better servant, a better instrument of something. So the desire to be useful is a very constructive one if it impels us to become useful by practical means. But the desire to be useful without the support of skills is one of the heaviest burdens that flesh must bear. For there is no one who can make more trouble or get into more trouble than the individual who wants to help people but does not know how to do anything. Merely follow his advice and you'll be worse off than he is. But if this usefulness, this impulse to help, to serve, to give, to share, impels us to achieve a means of usefulness that is proper and appropriate, then this is a desire, this is an emotion which we may regard as essentially commendable to our way of life. Another emotion that is commendable and proper is a deep emotional instinct to venerate, to seek to see value, the constant searching for the good, the resolution to see it, the sensitivity to recognize it. These emotions are very useful to us. Also the emotion of aspiration, the impulse or desire to become more like truth, to become more godlike, to unfold the best part of ourselves, to strengthen all the attributes of consciousness by means of which we become able to recognize virtue and also become skillful in the cultivation of it in our own conduct. Then, of course, there is the emotion of compassion, the individual attaining with all other insight and skill a certain intimate realization of the inevitable shortcomings of others, a desire to actually take a paternal relationship with life, in which those who do not know so much are no longer enemies or strangers, but children who must be instructed. A desire to save values, to save life, to serve people, to understand principles. Such desires as these are indeed commendable emotions and lead ultimately and instinctively to a sense of participation in the divine creativity of life at the source of our existence. So we do not necessarily say that all emotions are bad. We can only say that bad emotions are bad. but that the power of emotion is a kind of energy, and that this energy, which if used poorly, will make us the champion warriors of the neighborhood, can, if used wisely, give us new insights, new values, and make us perhaps the most companionable and interesting of all people. Much depends upon getting down to work and doing something with it. Getting down to work with a problem always seems to imply an immediate need. So let us assume for a moment that you have a fairly well-developed instinct to be an anxious person. That the problems you see around you cause misgivings. You're not very happy about the way the world is. You're not very certain as to whether or not you are going to survive the normal span of your years, or whether you will be one of those that might be sacrificed to some new atomic project. You are not quite sure what kind of a world you're bringing your children into. You're not too certain how long your business is going to last. You're not very confident about the present state of national or international finance. You're not quite certain whether our way of life is going to survive. We do not know how much or how long these patterns will build, and what the climatic situations will be. Now, there are two kinds of patterns in this world. Those patterns which come within the area of our influence. Things we can do something about. And those patterns which belong to areas which are so general or collective or so bound to the greater courses of motions that personally we have very little influence over them. These are the things we cannot do much about. Therefore, intelligence, integrity requires that we change those things which can be changed, and that we learn to live with those that cannot be changed. If we do not make this adjustment, we're in trouble. Now, it's not nice to live in a world that is not the kind of world you particularly like, but you have a lot of company, if that is of any interest to you. Practically every book that we get, the old manuscripts on palm leaves and on papyrus, the ancient inscriptions in clay and stone, the ancient carvings on the sides of hills, all of these bear witness to people of time and place distant to our own, who were not very happy about anything the way it was. There were old whitewashed inscriptions on the walls of Pompeii. It was destroyed in the 1st century A.D. by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And these inscriptions warned of the political corruption, the terrible difficulties that would attend the election of the wrong man. And they sound exactly like the ones we are writing now. And they were accompanied by the wonderful thought that never before in history, that was the 1st century A.D., had things been going to the dogs as rapidly as then. And things have been going to the dogs since the beginning. But of course the dogs don't want them, so they return them to us. And we have to keep on doing the best we can with them. Now, this period, therefore, of anxiety has to be measured in terms of value. If man as a being was destined to live forever in this particular world in which he now is, if he was created merely to weep over the graves of his own dead, it would be a pretty melancholy picture all around. But man was not created with a complete dependency upon this world. Man was not created merely to be locked forever in the peculiar patterns which arise in society. And here another great benevolence of the universe, which is generally misunderstood, has stepped in to make certain that no patterns could remain forever unbroken. And that mysterious agency is death itself. Death which is a release and a source of inevitable change. It takes the benefactor, but it also takes the tyrant. And in the presence of these immutable factors, the world has to change. It could not change if man himself was immortal, physically, because he would impose his own thought, his own wisdom, his own foolishness upon things so dogmatically that nothing could change. But as it is, all things move, and out of this motion new patterns are forever being created. A man looking at the world in its larger way realizes that there is no moment in history in which this world is not governed by those forces and processes most necessary for its own integration. The world has to be disciplined, just exactly as the individual has to be disciplined. We would all like a spoiled world, but nature will not give it to us. We can try to spoil it, but we can never succeed. Thus our great anxieties about things about which we can do nothing, or very little, can be resolved only by our own understanding of the reasons for things as they are. And if these reasons are examined honestly, with clarity, and with integrity, our anxieties are usually dispelled. There may be a nostalgic note of sorrow that things have to be this way. There may be a kind of regret that man hasn't seen better and hasn't performed more adequately the tasks of living. But perhaps we will also have this little tendency to exonerate man. We will remember childhood, and that childhood could not be a period of experience, of wisdom and of understanding, of maturity. And yet in childhood man makes mistakes sometimes that he must live with in his adult years. So man perhaps cannot do much better than he is doing. But man cannot fail. He will not be allowed to fail. And the great plan and pattern of things has shown from the beginning that he does not fail. So it is not impossible for us to take a constructive attitude toward that which we cannot change. It is perfectly possible for us to become so discriminating, so thoughtful in our observation of phenomena, that the laws governing it slowly become obvious to us. Then we can sort of relax and take an attitude of greater faith, because these things are moving, and they are in the hands of powers that have moved creation since long before there was even a spark of light in this great midnight sky around us. Man living on one little globe that is hardly more than a fly speck in space, surrounded by an infinite creation. There is really no need for man to sit down sadly on a rock somewhere, a small rock on top of the big one, and there gradually to come into the realization that because something isn't working out the way he expects it should, or the way he would like it to, that the universe is falling into chaos. It is not. The vastness of things makes it almost impossible for man to comprehend the massive pattern of which he is a part. And from this lack of comprehension comes his smallness of faith. But it is perfectly possible for him to return to God, the keeping of those things that belong to God, return to the infinite laws of nature, these patterns which these laws alone can work out, and be only able perhaps to gain the consolation of dimly perceiving the workings of these laws. But his larger hope lies in the fact that corruption has never yet succeeded in winning. And actually it never can. And in the ultimate solution of all problems lies nature's fulfillment. For nature is bringing creation as it would a plant, finally to its own fruitfulness. For the end of all things is that they shall be fruitful. And in the case of the universe, this fruitfulness is yet to come. So in this procedure, we have not so much concern or need for concern. Our emotions do not reach out to universals very successfully. We may read in the newspaper that 10,000 have died in a flood in China, so we just turn the sheet and reach for another piece of toast. We are not able to experience things which are too far beyond our daily life. We are not expected to take on the universe. Certainly, we are expected to help. And the moment something goes wrong, we are usually impelled to help. And under normal conditions, the heart of the world would be sending medical supplies and help to those areas where this disaster occurred. Everything we can do, we probably will do. But we cannot go beyond the experience of our own way of life, our own understanding, and our own conviction. Thus, a really healthy anxiety over things of vast size and duration. This is not very possible to us. We can only blindly worry. We cannot actually put the parts together and make anything out of it. So we come back to those things which we can change, usually the patterns in which we are personally or socially involved. And we know that if we are able to change enough of these patterns, that these changes will be felt collectively. If we can improve the living in the American home, the American way of life will be better. The large collectives will be served the only way we know how to serve them. The first thing that each individual can do for the common good is to so change himself that he is not detracting from the common good, because he is a unit of it. So he begins to think about those things that can be done. And he generally finds that he can bring more of universal law, universal wisdom, universal understanding into his own conduct, if he so desires. He can find ways in which he can keep the rules a little better. And he will find that as he keeps the rules, the natural causes of his anxiety will diminish. The individual who makes his decisions does not have to worry about them. The individual who has a clear-cut pattern which he is striving to keep finds in this pattern itself the strength for decision. It is the person who does not know what he believes, does not know what he is trying to do, who is always finding someone opposing it. His own weakness is his adversary. And if he is not certain, the patterns of other persons may encroach upon him. If he is going nowhere himself, someone else may try to drive him in their own direction. But if he has his patterns, those who understand will help. Those who do not understand will probably not have the strength to really interfere, because few people have any more strength of interference than they have strength of right character. Some people feel, of course, that an individual who has very little strength to do good has great strength to do evil. Usually this is not true. An individual whose strength of value is not strong makes neither a successful saint nor a successful sinner. He is simply unable to vitalize any attitude sufficiently. The only reason why we can be afflicted by the weak is because we are still weaker. There's no other answer to it. The individual who can bowl us over with 1 pound of energy is proving that we do not have available even 1 pound to resist him with. It is not the idea that somebody else's powers are so great that they are just irresistible. What really happens is that someone else is so persuasive that they finally convince us that we must do what we intended to do in the first place, which isn't always the right thing to do. So people nourishing our weaknesses affect us more than those who attack our strength. It is the individual who is forever ready to compromise his principles who can find an adversary always ready to help him. These patterns bring us into the very simple core of the problem of working with anxiety. First of all, if you find this habit is taking over, you are not able to quite evaluate things, that you are worrying too much about something and probably at the same time giving no thought to that which might be even more important. If the tendency is to the minor key, if you have built your home in the doldrums, if you are constantly and continuously in fear and more or less uncertainty, if things never seem to quite gel, but the general tendency is negative, then there are certain things that you can do. There are a number of things that you should do. First, of course, you don't need to go to an analyst and have an aptitude test. This is a sort of an optimistic term anyway, because most people take the test to find out not their aptitudes, but how few they have. And this problem very often solves itself by merely quietly sitting down and being honest with yourself for 5 minutes. This little honesty, such a little program of honesty is most therapeutic. And decide that there are certain fears or anxieties which are really contrary to what you yourself believe. You know you shouldn't have them, but you do. And you know there are certain people that you shouldn't take the attitudes to that you do, but you have those attitudes. And you also have a realization in yourself that most people are doing the best they can, that perhaps it's limitation on their own part, they can't do any better. Their background, their opportunities, their circumstances have stamped these impressions upon them, even as other circumstances have been stamped upon you. But when it comes time to being a little tolerant or a little patient with these people, we just don't seem to have the appropriate energy. It is much more easy to be irritated by them, or again to develop fears as to what they may do to us. Having discovered a few of these problems within yourself, there's only one answer to any situation that isn't what it should be. It has to be corrected by a certain continuity of personal effort. There is no way of doing nothing and arriving safely where you belong. There must be some kind of steering of this situation. And as you study the situation, analyze this situation also. How big is your thinking? How real and deep are your emotions? Do you love anyone? Or have you gradually insulated yourself so that you have a certain compromised relationship with people? A relationship based upon utility or upon endurance or upon survival, but not upon real value. How carefully have you thought anything through? How carefully have you thought your own fears through? To what degree are you simply negative? And this negativeness having no light in it, no warmth actually in it, is simply gradually becoming a brittle, acid state of consciousness. If you find tendencies in this direction, then remember the 3 or 4 basic points that we brought out in the beginning. To be negative, you must cultivate negativity. You must live in it, you must have it around you, you must have it in you. If you once break this pattern anywhere, it will have a tendency to fall to pieces everywhere. Negativity means that you are gradually falling into an introversional condition. That your inner life, composed of its own negative imagination, is taking over. that your contacts with values around you are not adequate, that your interpretive power of events is not adequate, that you are spending too much time thinking and feeling about yourself. The answer is to get busy, to find various activities in which you have less time. It is far better to work all night than it is to lie in bed and be sorry for yourself all night. It is necessary for each individual to go to bed at night with a firm desire to wake up in the morning to do something important. There should be a feeling when you go to bed, this is a little rest so I can go on with what I want to do. If the individual wakes up every morning into a vacuum, he is certainly going to fill it with his own negation. If he has nothing more important to him than a little small circle of immediate comforts and pleasures, he will have reason for anxiety, because these comforts and pleasures can be assailed. They can disappear almost any moment. And if we have nothing else in life, we are building our faith and our hope upon things so fragile that we have right to any anxiety that may come into our minds. If we are utterly dependent upon a few convenient, familiar things for happiness, unhappiness will never be very far away from us. If only one person in the world can make us happy, we are tying our destiny to a creature that might disappear at any moment. We cannot afford to put all these eggs in such fragile baskets. So anxiety arises where we have pinned our eternal hope to a thing that is not eternal, but is exceedingly fragile and impermanent. If only passing fragile things can give us happiness, then we are always in the presence of the danger of immediate unhappiness. But if our happiness arises from depths, from values, and from principles, they are unchangeable. We can lose those things which we have, but we cannot lose those things which we are. And our values must always finally rest upon things which are eternal and not things which are immediately destructible. We may enjoy the things we have, and we may enjoy them more because of better value in ourselves. We may be grateful that we have them, but we must always remember the old line from the service, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. If we change the word Lord to law, we may come very close to a cosmic truth. So the things we have are passing, even as we are. But the principles within us either bind us to eternity with hope, or they bind us to this passing parade with fear. And our resolve must assist us to make these decisions. Keep busy. Keep the mind occupied with large thoughts. Keep contact with people. Learn to think of people not as problems, but as invitations to insight. Think of people as ways of learning about yourself. Think of people in the same charity that you think of yourself. Do not just blame. Try to understand. Try to recognize that if you were that person, you would probably do what he does. But you are not that person, and you never can be. But you can be slow to condemn and quick to applaud. You can find, therefore, out of the power to recognize value in others, a new sense of security against the anxiety in yourself. What we see in other people, they also feel. If we trust them, they will be more trustworthy. If we are understanding, they will try more to understand us. Henry Ford, who employed hundreds of thousands of men, learned this truth, that the best way to get the most from another person is to trust them. Occasionally you may be disappointed, but in the majority of cases you will not be. Ford at one time employed enormous numbers of ex-convicts. He took men out of prison and put them into the presence of the temptation that sent them there. He took embezzlers and put them in the cashier's department. He gave ex-bank robbers custodianship over the funds with the box and the key. And he said in one of his papers that he wrote on this subject that having worked with thousands of these men, almost all of them regarded as dishonest and dishonorable, that he had more reliable people from that group than from the honest group. These people had learned to appreciate someone believing in them. They had passed through an experience, but they had learned something. And he was able to prevent them from falling into the embitterment which comes when this learning has no chance to express itself. Because in normal society, very few people will forgive or forget. So he proved these things in action, that you can find better value and make something of it. If you are more concerned with helping things to grow than you are concerned in punishing them for differing from you, you'll have a different kind of life. Anxieties arise usually from the wrong basic attitudes. Then there are these anxieties which arise from blind fears. Wherever they exist, solve them immediately. If you fear your health problems, if you fear some economic problem, work with it immediately and solve it. Never allow it to drift, to become the basis of habitual anxiety. For anxiety becomes a habit, and this habit must be broken. And it is broken by removing its cause. Of course, if you are a good worrier, you will always find another cause to put in the place of the one you get rid of. And then if you for a moment have none, you will really be bewildered. But if at the same time that you are disposing of such worries as can be solved, if at the same time you are building values in belief, conviction, understanding, discrimination, and skill to support, your time appointments will be more full. There will be less time for worry. You will go to bed tired from the things you are doing and not merely from the attitudes you are holding. And when you go to bed only with the exhaustion of psychic pressure, you will not sleep well. So these things gradually smooth themselves out. Anxiety can be overcome so that it may occur really, legitimately, only a half a dozen times in a lifetime. There may be moments when it will occur. But this endless fretting and fussing and worrying about things of no importance in the first place can be corrected. And all the byproducts which affect those around us so adversely can be prevented. And if we can get to work on some of these principles, we will be better off. Time's up, time's up, time's up, time's up. Now, next Sunday morning, we're going to have a discussion here of will, mind, and imagination versus basic consciousness. What is it that moves us? Is it Schopenhauer's concept of the will? Is it Sir William Hamilton's concept of the mind? Or is it the concept of psychic pattern of modern psychology, which comes into the imagination pattern? Are these things consciousness? Are they expressions of consciousness? What are they? And what is the power that moves us into the continual actions of the day? We want to discuss that at some length next Sunday morning. Now, I'd also like to call to your attention that the library and reading room, where our displays are on exhibition, will be open this afternoon, and they will also be open Saturday and Sunday afternoon next week. There will be friends that will show you the various exhibits if you have not had the opportunity to see them. We've had a number of requests to have the facilities open. So this afternoon and next Saturday afternoon and next Sunday afternoon, the facilities will be open, not for study, but for a certain little tour through the material we have on exhibit as part of our exhibition last week. And I want to take this opportunity also of thanking all of the friends who made the open house last Saturday and Sunday, I think, one of the nicest events we've ever had. The enthusiasm, the friendship, the service of these people, and the wonderful attendance that came to see our efforts, all this added together to make a perfectly splendid occasion. And behind the scenes of this very interesting affair was a very great deal of work done. And many weeks of careful planning and thinking and service went behind this affair, which flowed along so smoothly and so pleasantly. So we want to thank everyone at this time who helped to make it a success, either through their work or through their sharing or through their attending. And we hope that you all had a very nice time. I know that I did, and I think it was one of the nicest affairs that we've ever had here. And we want to thank everyone for helping to make it so. Now you will also notice that in connection with this morning, we have some publications that might help. We have one called 10 Basic Rules for Better Living. And I think for the subject of this morning, that would be a very useful bit of literature. Also, Solving Psychic Problems will help us a little with the problem of the pressures within us, and why these pressures sometimes make us do things rather badly. And our book, Self-Unfoldment, is a basic text for people who want to grow from the inside out along a rather quiet, peaceful, and safe course of procedure. This literature is available to you at the book table. We thank you for being with us this morning and hope to see you next week.